just to tie it all back to church, my upbringing, my community, my dad built, my parents' house right down the street from where he grew up, which is right down the street from his grandparents' house. I mean, it was like my entire upbringing was so rooted in this community atmosphere, and it was so integral to that. And then to move across the country to Washington for work, which I think is also a necessary thing to do. I mean, people do move away from their families in order to take risks and to be entrepreneurial. But then if it were not
and to spite their parents.
Exactly.
No. I'm kidding, Mom. I know you're listening.
No, but if it weren't for my church community here, that really has taken the place of my family community.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, if it weren't for that, I don't know how my mental health would fare overall, pandemic or not.
Mm-hmm.
It's so important to have that, surrogate family that you find in your church, that corporate fellowship that just becomes so integral to your life.
Yeah. No, it's been, I don't know. I'm trying to think of, the pandemic obviously accelerated a lot of trends, and I think it accelerated some things for the better and some things for the worse. It does feel like most were accelerated for the worse, but I also wonder, because we're having this conversation, if there is good that will come out of the tragedy, and I do hope that it made people more faithful, and I wonder if this demographic of people who report regular church attendance, I wonder if that's if that increased in and of itself over the course of the pandemic. You know what I mean? Like, I would be curious to see a poll about religiosity, because when people lose their jobs, when people suddenly lose loved ones, and some of these stories are so horrific, not even the people who died from COVID, but people who died during the pandemic and weren't, loved ones weren't allowed in the hospital. We've seen, women having to get their ultrasounds without their husbands, their partners. And it just makes me wonder if people are, finding relief, and, I don't know. What do you think?
Well, isn't it true also that the Gen Z generation has typically been more traditional than millennials? Is that a true statement?
In terms of they're dressing like they're in Little Women? No, this is a real thing. This is 100% a real thing.
I did notice that at Target.
No, okay, so go back to, this was in the New York Post, last January, after Little Women came out and was enormously popular. There was a story in the Post about how all of the city's consignment shops and thrift stores could not hold on to the Little Women aesthetic, clothes that match that aesthetic. They just the stuff was just flying off the shelves because women all wanted to look like Joe or Florence Pugh playing Joe in Little Women. And it's interesting to me that happened right before we were all just shocked back into this time period where death was so much more a constant part of our conversation.
Yes.
It's hey, you thought it would be fun to dress up like you were in Little Women? Wait until you try a pandemic.
Nice. And now they're all sitting around on their couches on Zoom in their Little Women attire, which is really great.
Wait, Kylie, let's talk about this. Okay. Actually, this is a perfect part of the conversation. Did you see the New Yorker cover?
Yes,
okay.
I did.
I'm going to describe this for our listeners. There was a New Yorker cover that came out last week, and I thought it was actually a really beautiful cover, a really poignant cover. It is a young woman. She looks to be in her late 20s or early 30s. She has a nice top on, and then she has on her bottom gym shorts and flip-flops, and she's staring with a martini into a laptop, at a Zoom happy hour in a dirty apartment filled with Amazon boxes, 2 cats. It looks like it's a studio apartment because it's got a little divider up behind her. And there's just stuff all over the place. A mask on the floor. And it's this very dark image of a young woman alone in an apartment building, in her late 20s or early 30s, dressed up on top, dressed down on bottom, surrounded by trash because she's had nobody to clean for.
Right.
I live in a really urban area, and I know a lot of people who have probably had moments essentially like the one depicted on the New Yorker cover. Mm-hmm. That's really bleak and it's really dark, and I feel like people like that aren't being drawn anywhere nearer to faith. If anything, they're being drawn nearer to Netflix.
I would agree. I think poignant is the perfect word to describe that cover. And when I looked at it, it was kind of like, this seems like how millennials were sort of headed.
Yeah.
Before the pandemic happened. And it's almost like if we're living in an episode of Black Mirror, the New Yorker cover is what happens, is like the logical end to the life that we've created that the pandemic has forced us into very quickly.
It's like Girls meets Black Mirror.
Yeah.
It's like the unlikely crossover you didn't think you needed.
Yeah, and it's the New Yorker cover. And like it is really dark because this is sadly the world we're living in.
Yeah, it is. And the thing about that is what moved me by that image is she's staring into a computer and she has a phone in her hand and she's talking as though she's on a video conference. And so that's using a computer. It's using the web conferencing technology. She has the phone in her hand at the same time. And these are all things that we were told we're going to bring this world closer together. Mm-hmm. And we're going to make us more connected, more understanding of each other. And this was just over a decade ago. And here we are in the midst of the pandemic. And if anything, the pandemic has highlighted that this sort of artificial closeness, much like we were just talking about how virtual church is no substitute for in-person mm-hmm. church, these technologies that give us artificial modes of connectivity are not substitutes, but we are completely chemically addicted to them.
It's also just this conglomeration of coping mechanisms. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like alcoholism meets online shopping meets technology overload. I mean, put all the things together that we use as our vices, and that's what we're living in.
Yeah, I love that because that's exactly what's happening in the New Yorker cover, yes, right? Like she's all of the things that how we sort of like nurse ourselves with.
It's also like there's no indication that she's been outside in a very long time. Like
it's
there's
dark.
No reason to leave. You know, right. You have cats. You don't have to take them out. You're like everything is being delivered to your doorstep. Cats are always just dark. You have stuff being delivered to your door. You're connecting with your job and your social life. Everything is done online. I mean, what's your incentive ever to leave your home?
Right. I mean, this is cutting a little bit too close for me.
Do you have cats, Emily?
No, I don't have cats. I am a cat person. Oof. I refuse to get a cat at this point. I do live in a very small studio apartment. I do spend a lot of time staring into a computer screen, oftentimes with my phone in the other hand. I will say, however, that the pandemic has made me cut down significantly on my drinking because it just like for a while there was like, you know, it becomes too much, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's when you don't have to be up early for a commute and you don't I felt like I really got into this like gluttonous habit in the early months of the pandemic. All of these gluttonous habits in terms of like ordering in food and staying up late and mm-hmm. blah, blah, blah. So I've just like really cut down on it because it was like too much of a good thing. And I wonder if that also applies. We saw The Social Dilemma come out, and that movie on Netflix has turned out to be a really big cultural moment. A lot of people have watched it. Did you watch it?
I haven't seen The Social Dilemma yet.
No, this documentary totally changed the conversation. It's a guy, Tristan Harris, who was on Joe Rogan's show, a big episode of Rogan, and it's basically the documentary is former tech workers, people whose jobs it was to create the chemical addictions that we all now enjoy so much. Getting together and talking about in this documentary what happened and why this is bad. Mm-hmm. And so it's just very interesting to me that documentary dropped, you know, as we were coming up on a year of the pandemic, because I am curious as if this sort of like too much of a good thing, too much Zoom, too much Twitter, too much Instagram is going to make people take a step back, or if we're just it's a lost cause. I think it's probably a lost cause.
It could be a lost cause. I think we see two extremes. I mean, we already see two extremes, like people that, I mean, as the Gallup survey indicated, mental health decline is huge. So of course there's some of that like overindulgence and just like, you know, things going the worst that they could go. But like in your case, you mentioned, and for others, like realizing that, you know, alcohol can't, you know, you can't just drink yourself all the time, and you can't go to church.
Okay, Kylee.
Yeah, this pandemic, if it revealed anything, it revealed Emily's alcoholism. And
yikes. Here I am, apparently on
this is not true.
The therapist couch. No, thank you, guys. I don't need Kylee to be my therapist. No. I am my own best therapist, and that's absolutely true.
This is where we really go wrong.
No, I just don't think. I feel like we all, to summarize, I think we all have experienced too much of a good thing, and we are all hyper aware of it, but none of us have the motivation to do a damn thing about it, because partially there's a chemical addiction involved with tech, and partially it is because our lives are just so comfortable in 2020 United States of America. That's of course not true for a lot of working people who had to go to their jobs and risk their health and risk their safety, their family's safety, to, you know, put food on the table. It's been a very different experience for people in that situation and people in my situation. But I do feel like young people in my situation, your situation, we know that all of this is a problem. Like, whether or not we've seen The Social Dilemma, a lot of us have, we know this is a problem. We know that we are lazy, and we know that we are addicted to tech, and we know that we don't spend enough time with our families, but we don't have the will to do anything about it.
So I guess that's pretty bleak. I guess that leaves us with like, where do we go from here? Like, do you think
we go to Mars, Elon?
Hey, do you realistically think that, you know, as the vaccine rolls out, as we start to see a return to normal, are you personally hopeful that as we, you know, see that we have had too much of a good thing, that we'll be able to pull ourselves away from these things that we've indulged in too much of during the last 9 months? That's
a really good question. And let's sort of close out by asking the question of how the girl in the New Yorker cover will be post-COVID, when we have the vaccine and things are back to normal. And obviously I'm projecting myself onto that New Yorker cover, unfortunately. I don't have the cats, though. I do appreciate, like, I'm sort of an introverted person, and I don't like people.
The most accurate thing Emily has ever said on a podcast ever.
And I have at times felt myself like thinking it would be great to hang out with these people that, you know, and other times I might be like, oh my gosh, do I really have to see this person again? And now I'm like, I bet you have something interesting to say. And so
that's what she says to me when I walk into the office.
Like, hey. Hello, Kylee.
I used to not want to see you, but I bet you got something interesting for me.
Yeah, so I don't know. I feel like this is becoming too personal and not useful to anybody else. But what do you think? Let me get your take on this, because you've sort of actually been in like a normal part of the country for the pandemic, as opposed to this like weird little beltway bubble.
I think we're in a weird moment specifically right now where people are starting to despair that there won't be a return to, or that we won't be able to pull ourselves out of these things because there is no light at the end of the tunnel. There is no return to normal on the horizon. That every time there is news that there's been a good development, the follow-up news is that development doesn't actually do anything, that, you know, this is just going to extend indefinitely, forever and ever, amen. And so I think it's hard to speculate about how we're going to pull ourselves out of this until we can actually see hope on the horizon that we will come out of it, and then be able to, you know, kind of reconstruct ourselves culturally to a point where we're healthy, and can engage with other people in a healthy way and go about our lives in a normal way. You know, it's difficult to think about how you're going to, you know, move forward from just this tech overload when you don't see an end to working remotely because there's no reason to. It's like, oh, okay, things are going back to normal, and then the cases rise, and so then there's more lockdowns, and then there's more mask mandates, and then there's hopeful news that a vaccine is coming that's immediately followed up with news that doesn't matter, we're still going to be wearing masks forever and ever, amen, because the vaccine, isn't going to do what we hope that it's going to do. And that's just this constant cycle that's just kind of drives people into more and more despair. And so I do think that once we are able to get over that hump, that we will be able to reconstruct, because I think people will be so burned out on Zoom happy hours. I mean, if this pandemic has taught us anything besides just church, it's taught us that virtual things are poor substitutes for human interactions as a general rule, and that we need community. And so if we can get past this moment of despair and this moment of no hope, I think we will be able to come back.
I think that's really well said, and it's something that I was trying to articulate, and then you hit on it, which is that we were, 2019, January of 2020, lurching towards this period of intense isolation, of intense tech addiction, and one thing we haven't talked about that I was thinking of just as you were speaking right now is like binge watching, right? Like the way that our entertainment platforms now incentivize and encourage and enable us to kick our feet back on the couch for a weekend and just binge intense amount of content. And again, like, did I rewatch every single episode of Vanderpump Rules in like the first 2 months of the pandemic? Yes, absolutely. But it is like, maybe this was sort of the antidote to all of the trends that were snowballing in 2019. We were about to hit this point of no return, and maybe this is something that gives us an opportunity to push doom off just a little bit more, because there, the girl in the New Yorker cover, a glass half full read on her would be that she emerges from the pandemic, healthier, ready to sort of like put the phone down, delete the apps, and find a spouse, all of that. That still brings us to religion, which I do think is central to, I think the decline of faith in this country we're learning is central to so many of our different problems. That's something that I think Tim Carney documented very clearly in Alienated America. We recently interviewed Mary Eberstadt on this podcast, Fury of the Fatherless, which explores how this would have impacted a lot of what we saw in the social justice movement over the course of the summer. Do you think, given this statistic that we started this podcast on, and we will close on this note, do you think that religiosity will increase as a result of the pandemic?
I think that it will. And not only do I think it will increase, but I think it will be less nominal. I think religion in America for quite some time has become, well, and we talked about this, a pretty watered down version of what it once was and what it should be, to the point where, sure, we're a Christian nation and a lot of people would claim that title, but they wouldn't fall into the category that the Gallup survey included as people whose mental health was excellent, because they don't attend church weekly. They don't prioritize their religious community. They don't actually have that tie. And so not only do I think it will kind of, I forget how you phrased your question, but kind of reinvigorate religion, I guess. Yeah. But that it will kind of strengthen it and give it more of an anchor so that it's less nominal and more devoted, because I think that's what we're actually missing versus just people who go to church or act morally. And I do think just what you just said too was a really good point, that I think this entire moment is just very redemptive, that we were headed toward a bad place, that this could actually bring us back in a way that it wouldn't have had we not entered the darkness of the pandemic. And as we approach Christmas too, just to kind of bring it full circle and wrap it up, one line of a song has really jumped out at me as I've been listening to Christmas music more than a person should, trying to get in the spirit. But in Oh Holy Night, there's a line that says, "A thrill of hope, the weary world rejoices." And I think that, as we're in Advent and we enter the Christmas season, that really is just a picture of like redemption in a nutshell, that, the world is dark and human nature is dark, and there is a thrill of hope, and post-pandemic, I think people have seen the darkness, and hopefully it can give them somewhat of a longing for the light.
No, I think that's true, because I think there's something about where we started this conversation, coming to terms with the utter darkness of the world. It's hard to see the world as such a dark place when you live in such a privileged era. Right. And that goes for people sort of across the board. I don't mean privileged in terms of just having gross amounts of money. I mean in terms of like the sort of in terms of modern medicine, in terms of the quality of life that most Americans enjoy right now. It's hard to see the darkness of the world when you enjoy all of that, but it is a very dark world. And you know, we again in modern America, we sort of have a shield from that a lot of times. So that's very well said, Kylee. What we're doing here is playing optimism cop and pessimism cop, and Kylie's just like referencing Christmas songs, and
I'm in the spirit, you know.
Well, I'm gonna go home and watch Vanderpump Rules again.
Emily's a Grinch.
Yeah. Well, I'm wearing green. You've been listening to another. I'm what?
If the shoe fits.
If the shoe fits. Does the Grinch wear shoes?
No. Oh, yes. I don't know.
Who knows? It's one of those things we'll never know. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky. She's Kylee Zempel. Stay tuned for more. We'll certainly be back with plenty more to say in the days ahead. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.